Hi everybody and welcome to Matrix Live Season 6 Episode 3. I'm afraid this week it's just me, and so I will continue to monologue for like 10, 15, 20, who knows how many minutes, to try to lead you by the hand through the wonderful world of imagination that is Matrix. And kind of occurred to me whilst writing the notes for this week that it's kind of hard for me to get through all the things which are going on in the core team these days, let alone the kind of wider community. And so I'm not going to try to do an exhaustive kind of this is what happened, what's happening in Riot Web and Synapse and all that sort of thing that we used to do, but instead just pick up on some of the bits which are particularly interesting from my perspective that I've been working on this week. And without further ado, might as well start talking about some of the delight stuff, as we call it, which is our desperate mission to improve the delightfulness and the usability of Element across all platforms. And one of the big things which we are rolling out in the very near future is actually going to be on the matrix.to home server, as well as Element, which is adding in social sign-on, as well as the normal username password-based stuff. Now, this is a little bit controversial, because if you delegate your identity through to, I don't know, Google or Facebook or Twitter or GitHub or GitLab or whoever we choose as our identity providers, then obviously you're linking your account to them. You're giving them visibility on what you're doing, and from a privacy perspective, it's not ideal. But from a usability perspective, it's really nice. It's using Gitter a lot recently. It's become, obviously playing it with it, and Gitter's onboarding is amazing. And the reason is that you just click on the login with GitHub link or GitLab link, and bang, you're in. And that's it. No captures, no sign up, no picking usernames, no picking avatars. You just do it and you're in. And given the number of people who have real problems selecting passwords and going through captures on the today's sign up for the matrix.org home server, at least, we really want to make it as easy as possible for first-time users who might not really care about Matrix or Element and just want to have a quick play with it to be able to get on board. So we're adding it in. Obviously, it's optional. You don't have to use it, but watch this space. And it will also improve our single sign-on enormously in that it will allow us to at last balance together sites or servers which mix together single sign-on as well as normal username password, which historically hasn't worked. And it will also force us to dog food the single sign-on a lot more than we have historically, which will in turn hopefully make it less likely to break for folks like Mozilla who depend upon it today. So that's social sign-on work coming out of the Element Delight team. Another thing that's been going on has been improving invites a lot, and matrix.to, and generally deep linking and providing ways of actually easily inviting people into the app. This has been driven a lot by Valère on the Android team, and in fact has just given a demo which we recorded, which I think will be probably in next week's Matrix Live, which will show what this looks like, but it even includes invite people by QR code and niceties like that. And talking of matrix.to, we have got this redesign of it from a few months ago, which was kind of soft launched. It's almost there, but there have been some real stumbling blocks on getting the UX right. It is such a bizarre pain in the ass to get matrix.to right. You'd have thought it's just take a URL and put it on the screen to link to it, but in practice, if you want to peek into that URL to give a nice avatar and a name and all the other kind of end user, mass user, mass market features that you'd expect, like a Discord invite link has or a Telegram one does, then we have a lot more fun to do in order to say which server do you want to peek into this room via. Should it be matrix.org? Should it be one of your own choice? How do we get the right balance between privacy and usability, just for a change? I think we've finally got it right, but it was ages of back and forth, and now Bruno is going and actually implementing the changes into matrix.to. Hopefully should be live next week, so watch this space for that. Another thing that's been taking up lots of time has been spaces in Matrix. I think we announced these 3 weeks ago now, 2 weeks ago, which is the next generation of communities. Now, work for this has been bubbling along, particularly on the design side. We now have more than just wireframes. We have full pixel perfect proposals of how the UX of this should look. Nothing to share yet, I'm afraid, but the interesting points which keep coming up are, should we have a tree view hierarchy, a bit like a file manager in the left panel, or should you kind of drill between columns as you go down through the hierarchy? Mac users will be familiar with this as being the holy war between classic Mac OS Finder and Next Step's column-based file browsing view. So we'll see. At the moment, we're testing them side by side with volunteers from the community who have reached out to give them a sneak peek and get kind of early user feedback. Watch this space for the results. What else can we say about spaces? We are determined to get something out by the end of the year. Right now, we're aiming probably for it to be on develop, probably behind a labs flag, but still something that can be used in practice. What else can I say about good old spaces? Some things have been descoped in the short term in order to try to hit that deadline, although I'm totally blanking on what they are now. I don't think it was any... Oh, it's the group-based permissions, like make everybody in this space an op in the room. Is unlikely to be there in the very first cut, but we'll almost certainly add it before we take it out from behind labs. Lots of fun trying to figure out how it's going to interact with the left panel, as I just said. And what else is happening on spaces? Work should be starting any day now on proper peaking support in Synapse, which is a prerequisite for spaces to work, because you need to be able to look into spaces over federation to see who is a member of them. So that would be super exciting to finally have peaking working over federation. What else have I been up to? I have been playing a bit on the Pinecone side of things. So Neil Alexander's peer-to-peer overlay project is actually coming along really well. We have peer-to-peer Pinecone running both on iOS in the Element P2P app as well as a standalone app. And I can quickly fire up peer-to-peer peer-to-peer Element on my phone and give you a sneak peek. There it is, Pinecone Party 2 running there, complete with images and everything, and me chatting with Neil on his server node. Now, it looks and feels a lot like the Yggdrasil-based iOS peer-to-peer demo that we had, except it's in a totally new code base, and it's using source routing rather than greedy routing to find the other nodes on the network. And I apologise for continuing to annoy everybody by posting stupid teasers on Twitter. One of the things which has come out of this is that even with source routing, it's still vulnerable to disruption in the main tree of the routing, because it works by basically creating a spanning tree over all of the nodes on the network. And if the root of that changes, whilst the actual network paths still work if you're source routing, it doesn't work particularly nicely for searching the DHT and finding who to talk to if the whole tree is flapping around from under you. So Neil is going off on a tangent now to have a look at VRR, which I think is virtual ring routing, which is a different routing approach to the source and greedy routing that respectively Pinecone and Yggdrasil use, and basically Pinecone is becoming a general testbed for experimenting with peer-to-peer overlay stuff until we get the right balance of something that is relatively immune to disruption on the network, and is also something that works well with Quick, which we're using as the transport for Federation over this thing. But it's really exciting to see the new code base working about as well as the Yggdrasil one did, and the question is to see how much further we can push it. Talking of crazy science fiction, also the Cerulean threading demo has been continuing, but not on the UX side. It's been almost entirely on the spec side. And this has been really exciting. Had a really fun chat with Keegan, who's been working on it yesterday. And the question is basically, how do you model threads for a Twitter-style experience in Matrix? And we've gone through 4 different iterations so far. The original idea was to just replicate the messages, the tweets, the posts, the toots, whatever you call them, over the timeline rooms of the people participating in a conversation. So I might have #Matthew on matrix.org, and you might have #Amandine on matrix.org. And if I were to send a tweet or whatever, or a post, let's call them post. If I send a post that mentions Amandine, I would expect a copy to be on my timeline, and I would expect a copy to end up on her timeline too. And if she responds, it would be threaded within her timeline room, and it would also get copied over to my timeline room. So people who are joined to my timeline will see the conversation, and likewise people who are following her by joining her timeline will see the conversation too. So it would look and feel a bit like Twitter, and I thought that this would be a nice way to go. Unfortunately, it's a bit ugly. Obviously, you're duplicating the data, which is a bit redundant. Secondly, threading these things together is a bit icky because you don't know even what event to use, because you don't have a single event identifier for your messages anymore. Also, if you redact them or if you edit them, it ends up getting quite inconsistent. So, you literally have different flavors of the conversation in different places due to the lack of single sources of truth. So another approach that we then switched to was, hang on, why don't we do cross-room threading? So why do threads have to be within a room? You just have my message in my timeline, one message in her timeline, and if she's responding to me, then she would have a reference that goes back to my message, and it will kind of ping-pong between the 2 rooms. The problem is then that it's not very matrixy, frankly, that if you're joined to a room, you're only going to see one side of the conversation, and your client is going to need to understand cross-room threads if it's going to render it at all. Also, it becomes surprisingly hard from a federation perspective, because you need to kind of spider both rooms in order to go and map out the conversation, which is, again, a bit ugh. And then you also have the amusing problem that if you want to forward search through a thread rather than just searching up through the parents, you basically need to double link the thread. So the children need to link to the parent, but also the parent need to link to the children. And causality-wise, that's kind of hard, particularly in Matrix, where events are immutable. So instead, you find yourself needing to post a child pointer in the room in the timeline, which kind of forward links through to the child at the same time that you respond to a message. Therefore, to reply to a message, you now have to send 2 events, and one of them is in the other person's room. Therefore, you need to have write permission to their timeline and be joined to their room in order to just respond to something. And again, that's not very idiomatic, and it starts to feel a bit clunky. So then we moved to having threads as rooms and thought, hey, why don't we just create a new room for every thread? So every time you start a new kind of tweet style sequence, create a room for it, and then we can kind of link to it somehow from the timelines using perhaps these forward pointer things I mentioned earlier. So you still would need to send 2 messages every time or 2 events, I should say, every time you send a message. One will be into the main timeline room, but the others will be pointers from, one will be in the main thread room, the others will be pointers effectively from the timeline room, from your timeline room. So people who look at the timeline will be able to see all of the things that you've said by pointing into the threads, the thread rooms where you said them. And this starts to sound a bit more interesting. It's a lot more matrixy in that if you join the thread room, you can follow what's going on in that room. You're not having to jump back and forth between different rooms. It does have the disadvantage, though, that you lose the equivalent of like a private tweets or a private timeline thing. So if I want to set myself private, as people do, say, on Twitter an awful lot, there isn't any way to suddenly render all of those messages as private because they're just sitting there in a whole bunch of thread rooms. So that's a bit unfortunate if you were trying to get parity with Twitter. What other disadvantages are there of this one? I think those are the main ones. It's also a little bit nasty that when you look at somebody's timeline, you're going to have to spider all the random thread rooms that they're in, but it might not be the end of the world. However, we did then think of another possibility, which is it's called backbone rooms. And, oh, no, that was it. The other problem. Oh, no, hang on a sec. Let me get this right. No. Let me finish. Thinking of backbone rooms, this idea is that the structure of the thread sits in a room, and instead you effectively point out from that backbone of the room to all of the timeline rooms, which then contain the actual messages, the message contents. And this is nice because if people want to go and set themselves private, they can just lock down their timeline room and stop people peeking into it or kick out followers that they don't want to be looking at it. However, the structure of the thread is still intact in that backbone room. And thinking about this a little bit more, you realize that quite a useful way to implement that might be to have the concept of symlinks in Matrix. And what would happen if you had an event which can go and effectively symlink to another one? So your backbone room ends up being this nice thread of basically symlinks that go through to the messages on the other timelines, which form the actual contents of the messages. And so you don't duplicate the contents. If you can resolve the symlink because you have permission to peek into the remote room, the timeline room, you can. You could even go and redact things, and I think it basically gives you the flexibility that's needed. It's not that matrixy, unless, of course, your server was able to expand out symlinks, and then you could join the backbone room and see the messages in place without actually duplicating the contents. So that's kind of been the journey that we've been on over this week, trying to figure out the long-term structure based on the lessons learned playing around with Cerulean of how we could do threads in Matrix, particularly in using Twitter-style semantics. And another nice thing, actually, is that this model also supports a Hacker News or a Reddit-style model where you don't really ever look at people's messages via timeline, at least as a first-class citizen. And in that instance, you would just put them straight into the backbone room and to get those sort of semantics. So I think the MSC 2836 from memory has been updated to incorporate this idea, and it basically takes the form of removing cross-room threading entirely and instead adding in a symlink MSC to provide that kind of functionality when it's needed. So watch this space to see how that goes. We've obviously gone back and forth on it lots, but it's being implemented in Cerulean and Dendrite at the moment to see how it goes. There's another whole bunch of interesting stuff on threading about how you know whether you can whether you've hit the extremities of a thread or not, because it's quite possible that a thread might have 1,000 replies to it or 1,000,000 replies, and obviously you don't want to proactively paginate them all in, but you also need to know how many there are, but it also needs to be buzz and time fault tolerant. It's very similar to the problem we've considered in the past of how do you prove that somebody has hit like 1,000,000 times on a post. Obviously you don't want to have to download 1,000,000 like events in order to render the 1,000,000. Instead, you need a proof that that has happened. So we're finally solving that one in the context of threading too. Again, for details, go and look at MSC 2836. Finally, something that I've been excited by, but I also don't know anything about, has been on the Synapse side of things, where Eric has been looking at speeding up state resolution. And I understand that the approach being taken is to look at the current bottleneck of state resolution, which is calculating off-chain differences. And this is a kind of fundamental part of state res v2 in particular, where you look at the off-chain of events and was working out tie-breaking what the current event, what the resolved state of a room should be. You go and look at the difference between the off-chains of the two scenarios that you're comparing. Now, apparently this can take a lot of CPU, particularly if the off-chains have got big, and there are pathological scenarios where lots of users are coming and going, where it's quite easy for that to get big. I think that Eric has figured out a way to basically collapse the DAG down into consecutive, basically collapse linear sections of the auth chain DAG together so that it's much faster to calculate the auth difference. And I heard something like 10x improvement in performance there, at least for that operation, which will be good. So that's running in a proof of concept, needs to be ported into Synapse, which I think is happening right now. And what else? There's probably a lot more work that can be done there, like things like incremental state res and chunked state res that we were looking at years ago now, like 2018, but hasn't been updated for V2 state res. But I guess the next thing beyond optimizing the off-chain difference calculation might be to look at that again. So, apologies for monologuing for so long. That's what's happening in my head right now. Sorry that Amandine can't join us. She is busy doing Element things, and hope this was vaguely interesting and useful. Thank you for watching Matrix Live, and thank you for flying Matrix. Have a splendid weekend, and speak to you soon. Bye.